So last week we looked at the city of Jerusalem, which contained the temple. I want to just read to you something about before the temple was built and when King David was asking God if he could build the temple. We're in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 1. Now when the king, that's King David, lived in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all his surrounding enemies, the king said to Nathan the prophet, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God," that represents the presence of God, "the ark of God dwells in a tent." It had been in a tent since the time that they travelled from Mount Sinai across the desert, and still, even though they had settled in Jerusalem, King David had built himself a great castle, you might say, a house for himself. This is God's response to David. "The Lord declares to you," in the end of verse 11, "that the Lord will make you a house, David. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son." So what's happening here is David says, well, I want to build you a house. And God says, no, I'm going to build you a house. It's a play on the word house, of course. And what God means is I'm going to build you a dynasty. That your household, the line coming from your family will be kings before me. So now he's talking about David's son. Verse 14, "I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. But my steadfast love will not depart from him." Verse 16 to David, "And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." God saying, I'm going to, your son Solomon will reign in your place, and he's going to build the temple. But actually your kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom. I want us to think about what that means for a moment. We're going to come back to that, but for now, our topic for today is Babylon, and the topics are all place names. We've begun with Eden, and then Babel, Sinai. Last week was Jerusalem, and now Babylon. And Babylon is kind of back to Babel. And you see, what happens in Babylon is that the kingdom that was established, the kingdom that God promised to David, is basically finished. Not like what God promised to David. There's a bit of a problem there, isn't there? And you see, the problem we have is that God made this promise to David that your kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, but here it is being destroyed, being shattered, being scattered, as it were. So last week we saw that the city of Jerusalem was never the ideal that it was meant to be, and this week we see that actually it was totally destroyed. When the Babylonians came, the city was destroyed and the temple was destroyed. So what happens next? So what's going on here? Well, what's going on is what God said would happen. If we go back to Sinai and the time of Moses, after God met with his people and spoke to them on Mount Sinai, they took a good 40 years to go across the desert. And then when they finally reached the land and they were about to enter, Moses spoke to them in the book of Deuteronomy. And I'd like to read to you some of the things that he said to them there. We're in Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 15. "But if you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do all his commandments and all his statutes that I command to you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. Moses has given them the 10 Commandments again and some other instructions from God. And he's saying, if you don't follow God's way, if you don't follow God as your king, as your Lord, then these are the things that are going to happen to you. He continues in verse 25, the Lord will cause you to be defeated before your enemies. We then jump ahead to verse 64. And the Lord will scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other. This is exactly what God said would happen to them. You see, the point of this, this series, and we're talking about gathering and scattering, is what we see is when God's people don't follow him, when people try to live without God, then they become scattered. God scatters them. The only way that we can come together as humanity, the only way that we can live in unity is under God, with God, alongside God. And when we don't have God, then that's when the problems begin. In the next chapter of Deuteronomy, after God has scattered them, it says in chapter 29, verse 24, all the nations will say, why has the Lord done this to this land and to the people? What caused the heat of his great anger? Then people will say, it is because they abandoned the covenant of the Lord, the God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. And they went and they served other gods and worshipped them. And the Lord uprooted them from their land in anger and fury and great wrath, and cast them into another land as they are this day. So that's the bad news, what happens when they turn against God. But it doesn't finish there. Chapter 30 of Deuteronomy, verse 1, and when all these things come upon you, when you call them to mind among the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, God is saying, when you end up in these other countries, just as I've said would happen, and you remember what I've said to you, verse 2, and return to the Lord your God, you and your children, and obey his voice in all that I command you today, with all your heart and with all your soul. Verse 3, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you, and he will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. They will be scattered, but God is going to gather them. Verse 4, if your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, no matter how far they have been scattered, from there I will gather you. The Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will take you. Verse 5, and the Lord your God will bring you into the land that your fathers possessed, that you may possess it. And he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. And listen to this one, verse 6. And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. Well, here is the good news. When God has sent them off into exile, into Babylon, when they return to God, they remember, they repent, they come back to God, then God says, I will bring you back to the land. He says, you will be more prosperous than you were at the start. And not only that, but I will circumcise your heart. Basically what that means is I will work in your heart so that you will want to obey me. It won't be a burden, but actually your desire will be. It won't be a struggle, but you will want to obey God from your heart. Now, the big question that we have to ask is, did that happen? Actually, it didn't. after they came back from Babylon, the temple was rebuilt, but it wasn't half as good as the temple was before. You know, we fast forward a couple of hundred years to the time of Jesus, and they're under Roman occupation. And the northern part, they never returned. And so here they were again occupied in the time of Jesus, and these promises have not yet been fulfilled. What does it mean? I'd like to read that last verse from Deuteronomy again, chapter 30, verse 6. The Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. Notice that last phrase, that you may live. Do you remember when we were working our way through John, that life was one of the favourite things that John liked about what Jesus talked about. Jesus said, I have come that you may have life and have it abundantly. John writes so that we would believe in Jesus, and so that by believing in Jesus, we would have life in his name. In John 14, Jesus says, if anyone loves me, he'll keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. The first part of the verse in Deuteronomy said that God will circumcise your heart so that you will love the Lord your God. And that's what Jesus is talking about in this verse in John chapter 14. The reason that the promise wasn't fulfilled in the nation of Israel is because it's fulfilled here in Jesus. The history of the nation of Israel is pointing forward. It's giving us a model, a glimpse, if you like, but it's actually pointing forward to the real thing that we find in Jesus. When people's hearts really will be clean, when God's Spirit will come and change us. This was fulfilled in Jesus. Babylon is a place where God's people were once again scattered because they turned their backs on God. In Jesus, God gathers his people again, never to be scattered again. God lives in us now by his Spirit, and he changes our hearts so that we want to obey him. The scattering of Babylon was looking forward to the regathering in Jesus, in the church and in the New Jerusalem. Well, how can that help us today? Well, I found that the trials of lockdown can bring out the worst in us as we miss many of the freedoms that we usually enjoy, as we have to live with uncertainty, not knowing what's happening, when it's going to finish, as we live in close proximity with others who are also going through their own issues, who are also finding life stressful. And as we rub up against one another, that can be hard as well. Some of us have had physical injuries and illnesses, and that is much harder to cope with in a lockdown situation where life isn't like it normally would be. And then we have, you can watch the news and see decisions that are being made, some that we like, some that we don't like. We see go outside and see other people doing the wrong thing and making life harder for the rest of us. It's all a bit difficult, isn't it? It can bring out the worst in us. This is a time to grow in our patience, in our love, in our trust in God. It's a time for confession as we see the sin in our hearts coming out. It's a time for God to be working in us, working in our hearts by his Spirit, forgiving us, making us more beautiful like Jesus, growing us in the fruit of the Spirit. Our current scattered state reminds us of Babylon, but we live not in Babylon or in the nation of Israel, but we live after Jesus. Jesus who has scattered his people, not in that city of Jerusalem, but in congregations all over the world. In St. John's, he's brought us together. And one day he will gather us to himself in the heavenly city, the heavenly Jerusalem, where there will be no more sin and no more disease. Can you see that this is the message of the gospel? The news, the good news of God forgiving us, bringing us to himself, even though we turned against him, gathering us in his Son, Jesus. This is the good news that defines and creates us as God's own people. It's the news that is our message to a world that so needs to hear it. It's the way that we work towards more people knowing God more deeply. Amen.